Irene, welcome to the show. For anybody that hasn't come across your work before, could you just give us like a brief introduction about the work that you do? That would be good to hear.
Yeah, so I'll do the quick version and then we can get into details if we need to. But I'm originally trained in exercise science and biomedical science and all that human health and nutrition and fitness stuff. And then along with that, I followed a path of going more into the mind-body world, namely and I'll just name them, the Feldenkrais method. I learned and trained in 2004, Somatic Experiencing, the work of Peter Levine. I've gone the full distance with that, up to even assisting at his masterclass levels. And then also trained in something called Somatic Practice, which is the work of Kathy Kain, and also Stephen Terrell. And that work combined with SC really encompasses sort of the we could say the what's the word I'm looking for? The holy grail, if you will, of somatic trauma healing work at the body, nervous system, environment level. And so in my current work, I bring all these things together, the Feldenkrais, the SC, the somatic practice, currently into online learning and teaching. However, I was in private practice for a lot of years, from really 2005 up until just about 4 years ago. And so, yeah, I call myself, there's no real word for us, the way, a psychotherapist would be called a psychotherapist, or a physical trainer or therapist would be called that. But I tend to call myself a nervous system expert and a somatic practitioner. So we'll call myself that today.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. So you obviously use so many different, or you've integrated so many different approaches and modalities to get to where you are. I'm just curious, have you thought about any foundational principles that you that cut across all of these fields?
Yeah. If I put my Feldenkraisian hat on, so that's the work of Moshé Feldenkrais, one of the principles that I adore and use all the time from his side of things, and it bleeds into also Peter's work, is the importance of awareness, self-awareness, body awareness, environmental awareness, really being in the present moment and being with the body. And that would be one of the key primary principles. But then from there, you kind of open up Pandora's box, because most, and I'm being very general here, but most humans, until they've gotten into this work, they don't usually know what that means or how to even attempt to bring awareness to their bodies or to their consciousness, or to however you want to call it, just because of our upbringing, our conditioning. Society tends to kind of cut us off from our awareness and our body, as you probably know. Definitely like that here where I live in a British colony, Canada. People are very, very good at keeping it all in and keeping it together and not showing emotion. And so again, that awareness piece of, wow, am I actually holding on to emotions, or am I not feeling my body, even though I'm a marathon runner, which happens, those sorts of things. So I would say that would be one of the first ones. And then after that, something that again, this kind of falls through the neuroplasticity world, is the importance of sequencing people's healing and incrementally helping a person gain that awareness, not in one big blowout, session that leaves them completely spent and not knowing what hit them, a box of Kleenex kind of later, but as you would a child, teaching them the ABCs, how to crawl, how to roll. You can't teach an infant everything they need to know, not even in 1 year, let alone 5 years. And so another part of, we could say, this holistic view of healing the human system is we have to see the system as needing time to integrate, time to learn, because that's really the primary thing that I teach my students is I teach them how to learn again, how to relearn how to learn, how to not beat themselves up when they're learning something new, even when they get something wrong. So again, this incremental piece by piece, we would call it titration in the somatic experiencing world. You've probably come across that, little drops that essentially, if we use that metaphor, eventually fill up the bucket. But we don't want to overflood the system. So those are like the two first ones that I'll speak to.
No, that's really interesting. Just I would totally agree with what your teacher told you. I think you said Sue Crawford about
Yeah.
you have an incredible gift to make complex things really simple. And anybody that's listening to this that's interested in learning polyvagal theory or getting an introduction to it, that's actually how I discovered Irene. She's got an introduction to it online on her YouTube channel, which is a great resource.
Yeah.
So next, Irene, I'm just curious to ask, what your work focuses on nervous system regulation and really sort of working at the level of the nervous system. Most of the people listening to this will be sort of in the business of helping others, and I'm just, why would you say it's vital for people to, particularly mental health professionals, to understand how the nervous system works?
Gosh, do we have 5 hours? Well, in all honesty, the nervous system, there are many parts to it. And you just mentioned the polyvagal. So I definitely encourage people to look those up on my site, because it's not all accurate what you get out there when people are teaching about it. But the thing with the nervous system that we have to understand is there's a couple different there's different nervous systems in the body. Mainly, we have our central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, so central to the body, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves that snake and feed out of the brain and the spinal cord. And the vagus nerve, as one example, is a cranial nerve that comes out of the brain, and then it feeds through and it goes like everywhere. When we have had any type of chronic stress, trauma, abuse, adversity, birth trauma, medical trauma, attachment wounds, war, PTSD. I mean, let's just put them all in a bucket. That doesn't just impact, your pinky finger. It doesn't just impact the amygdala. It doesn't just impact the gut. It impacts the entire system. My best analogy to pull one in is, when you go on a plane and you're pressurized, and sometimes your ears feel that pressure and you feel it in your body, and you'll have a water bottle that, as soon as you're up, you can release the pressure, and you have toothpaste in your bag and it might explode and your pens might explode. So that pressure is impacting not just your ears, it's impacting everything in that plane, right? And so when we've had some kind of trauma, stress, whatever you want to call it, everything in the body is being impacted. And so the nervous system, I'm getting a bit more distinct at calling it not just nervous system work, but somatic and nervous system work, because our muscles, our organs, our movement patterns, how we connect with the world, how we don't connect with the world, everything is impacted when we've had a real chronic adverse thing happen to us, or series of things, or an entire lifetime. And so for mental health professionals, first of all, one absolute necessary resource is the book, When the Body That Keeps the Score. I'm getting that wrong, I think. The Body That Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk. It's a hard read if you're not already versed in that, because I will put a disclaimer there. Some folks have read it whom are more in the lay population, and it's been incredibly triggering. So it really is meant for professionals. But as he states in that book, and I'm paraphrasing the whole book, pretty much most psychiatric illness, mental disorders are based in the physiology, in the nervous system, in the body, as a result of the things that the body endured and survived. Mm-hmm. And so with that, when there is, let's say, what we would call a mental trouble, a trouble of brain processing, we have to look at the whole system and what within this entire web of nervous system, nerves, the physiology, how the body moves through space. All of it has to be kind of played with and addressed and kind of dissected. So that's kind of a first level. I'll pause and see if you have any pieces, and then of course I have more to say.
No, that makes sense so far. We interviewed Pat Ogden for this summit as well, from Sensory Motor Psychotherapy, and one of the things that she said that really sort of stuck out for me, she's like, the body tells a story, and it seems to be what you're saying as well, that the body has a memory. You know, these things get stored on some level.
They do. The body has intricate, implicit, we would call it memory. And that is what it's called, implicit memories. And there's different types. Like, I'm assuming you and I both know how to tie our shoelaces. And we learned that when we were real wee and little, and we probably don't remember how, just like riding a bike. That's a procedural, implicit kind of memory that's written in the, not just the brain, but in the motor memory, right? Have you ever tried to tie your shoes the other way? You know,
Don't think so.
It's really difficult if you try to do it, because it's just an automatic movement pattern. And so Pat's right. I mean, Pat originally studied with Peter, so they come from the exact same world. And when we've had, and I'll just use one example. So let's just say, and this doesn't mean that this is the only example, but let's say someone was hit when they were young. You know, they were abused physically, which happens sadly all the time. And that little person couldn't defend themselves because they were super little, or if they tried, they got hurt more. So they stop the defensive pattern of wanting to push or scream or kick or run. That's fight, flight, right? And then that person is now 30 years old, 40 years old, 16 years old, and they can't figure out why they have so much anxiety, why they're so scared of people, or they're scared of certain people when they're on the side to them. And then we can trace back, oh, every time mom hit me, she was on my left side. So whenever someone comes to the left side, there's a little bit of a flinch, right? Kind of, for those that are just listening, kind of doing a body movement that would appear to be like a wanting to retract. And so that is not conscious, that is unconscious. So that is that autonomic nervous system that isn't just storing that in the brain, it's storing it in the sensory motor aspects that never got to be actually played out. So we would call that, at least in somatic experiencing, the need to deactivate stored traumatic procedural memory of fight and flight. Now, another part of that is the freeze response, which is kind of on that spectrum of survival, impulse, stress, energy. One thing, and this actually was just coming up in conversation with a student the other day, a lot of times people feel that when they feel the freeze response, when they're doing their healing work, they think that's bad. Like, I don't want to go into freeze. It's like, actually, no. You want to touch into that freeze energy without fear, so that you can unlock the layer of freeze that you've been holding on since that time when your mom did the thing to you, blah, blah, blah. But you want to feel the freeze and feel the terror and the immobility of not being able to shout, kick, whatever, but then stick with it long enough and stay alert to it. And this is where being connected to the environment and that awareness that I mentioned is super important, because then, and I'm kind of giving you like a grand model of how this might work, that person would then, as a 30-year-old or whatever, act out the movement or the words or the scream or the kick, or I'm running, I gotta run. And then they would complete that incomplete procedural memory because they've had enough capacity to dip into and feel the absolute terror that is coupled with that freeze response. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Normally we think that we should avoid things like the freeze response or whatever, but you're saying in order to properly heal, you have to be able to sort of access it from a conscious state and act the trauma out and process it, and then you can move on from there.
Pretty much. It's if we don't, okay, I'm gonna backpedal a bit. I would never ask someone to do that on, like, say, if I was working one-on-one the first session.
Yeah.
I would only do that if I knew that that person had already foundational capacity and the ability to handle that level of intensity. This is where, again, that incremental titration piece comes in. It would be like putting someone on the top of Everest, Mount Everest, or even at base camp who has never exercised in their life and asking them, I need you to do some jumping jacks right now. They physically wouldn't, like, they would probably pass out of hypoxia, and they wouldn't even be able to maybe breathe in that atmosphere because their system is so deconditioned. So we have to think about this nervous system healing stuff in the same way. If a person has never had real fundamental training to stay in their body under even minor stresses, we cannot ask them to dip into the scariest memory of their life in that moment and say, let's just figure this out. We have to kind of layer it. And what actually happens, Niall, is when that foundation and capacity has been built and there's tons of resiliency, a person actually welcomes that feeling of freeze because they know, because again, this is another important part of the work that I do, at least, is educating my students, because they know, oh, wow, my breathing is going down. I'm all of a sudden feeling really cold. My vision is starting to go really, really tunneled. And I feel like I'm going to die. And if a person can be with that somatic quality while keeping their higher brain on board to witness it, that's also that awareness. They can then literally dip into that memory, be with it, see it, not re-traumatize themselves, act out, move, release, emote, whatever it is. Maybe it's just heat that comes off the body. Maybe it's tears, doesn't matter, whatever it might be. They can be with it, let that stuff out, stay present, know that it is, we're doing this on August 2nd. I know that it's this day, the year is 2022. My name is Irene, and I'm feeling that terror, and I'm going to go on this roller coaster ride. And then they do it, staying present. And then they literally, if you think about a roller coaster, it comes in and then it just sort of levels out and everything settles. That's what we want to do in the case of shock trauma. Early trauma is a little different, but with that kind of event, that's what we're actually wanting to dip into. And I think a lot of what happens is people feel that freeze, and then they think they're going backwards in their healing. And it's often because they haven't been given the education to know this is actually really good. Just like a lot of people, when they start to do this work, at least my work, they'll start to feel what we would consider or call anxiety. And I actually, that's good, because that means that your freeze response isn't clamping down all that survival stress that you've had to bury away because you didn't have the capacity to be with it. And so, this isn't just me speaking. This is how Peter taught us. It's like when you start to work with someone, especially someone with a very chronic, let's say, fatigue condition, an autoimmune condition, and they've been so numbed out, you have to almost say, are you willing to go through a period of life where you're going to be a little unstable with your heart, with your body, with your sympathetic arousal, because you have been suppressing this for so long, which is what causes, as we know, these syndromes, these autoimmune conditions, these pain conditions, because it can be a lot. But from my experience, Niall, when we teach people these increments and really get them so dialed in with the basics, the turmoil is a little less intense, because it's like they're really good pilots of their system. They've mastered the basics. So now when they're going, I'm full of analogies today, they've mastered the basics of flying a plane. So now when they go into turbulence, it's no big deal. We know that this plane is built for this, and it is, and it will literally come out the other side. Right. So yes, that's a very quick example somewhat of healing at this somatic / nervous system, stored memory, mental, physiological level.
Yeah, you've explained that very well. So it's really using this process of titration to gradually build up this sense of groundedness in clients and in people, and then that then allows them to go through the freeze response or the revisit the trauma from a place of strength where they have the capacity to cope with it. Is that fair to say?
Totally fair to say. And I'd add maybe a couple more descriptors, more resiliency. They have more capacity to stay in flow, even when they're experiencing a really big emotion or energy or, heat wave in their body or tremor in their body. When they feel these, we could call them symptoms, but I don't like that because it's so medicalized. So when they feel these sensations or these body movements that make zero sense, they stay open in their we would call them in our work diaphragms, the joints. Some Eastern traditions might call them the chakras. It's like we're staying open in the energy centers. The chi is flowing with this tsunami wave that's going, because even in a tsunami, it's still flowing, right? It's just really big. So yeah, this ability to stay resilient, aware, tethered. This is super important to the here and now. That is incredibly important for people who are healing from, let's say, near-death experiences or surgical trauma or real like horrific abuse where they've had to literally pull themselves out of their body because it's just been too intense to stay in their body. Like that classic, I literally floated out of my body and saw myself, which is what happens in a lot of these instances. So part of the work is really teaching a person to stay grounded, as you use that word, and embodied at the same time. So yeah, it seems super simple, and it is. And because of our human conditioning, we've become really good at compartmentalizing how we heal. It's like, okay, I'm going to sit and just work on meditation on this day at this hour. And then I'm going to do my fitness routine on this day at this hour. I'm going to do my art class on this day at this hour. But really part of, I think, the holistic element of healing is very holographic. We're wanting to have the ability to have all that stuff happening at the same time, whether we're talking to someone, cooking food, walking the dog, or we are doing a more spiritually based practice. And I think what has really, is being uncovered is how prevalent spiritual bypassing is in the somatic and mind-body communities, that people think that they're doing higher consciousness work with meditation, but really what's happening is they're going into a freeze response and they're not actually present, but they think that they're in a good place because they feel good, but that feel good is actually the system being numbed out. I'm sure you've come across that in your talks with people.
That's so interesting. And I've heard you say elsewhere that, once you get the somatic piece in place and the nervous system in place and properly, organized, things like spirituality sort of emerge as a byproduct, but you can't just jump. You have to get that right first. It's the foundation,
It is so cool when that happens, because it often is not something that people are thinking is going to happen when they do this nervous system rewiring regulation work. Is they'll find themselves, and not because now they're sitting, and praying necessarily, they're just feeling more that oneness with whatever you want to call it, whether it's God or the universe or the multiverse or the animals or the ocean. It doesn't matter. It's not just me. And what often occurs when we've had so much adversity and stress is we really think that we are totally alone and there's nothing out there. There's like a void. And so, yeah, what's really cool is when I see my students start to really become like masters of their nervous system physiology, they just find themselves being more spiritual by default. They find themselves being more kind to strangers who are pissing them off, and it's sort of what these masters say, be kind, be empathetic, don't cause a fuss, just be with the person, even if they're being crazy to you. And some people will meditate till the cows come home to try to acquire that, but it's often with force and willpower. But from what I've seen, when the human system has resiliency and this regulation on board of the nervous system, and we're somatically connected, and our movements have fluidity, and we're healthy, of course, food and diet and exercise and all that is important. But when we get this physical, like 3D vessel really dialed in, to sound a little more, what we could say out there, our higher consciousness, our technologies of consciousness, telepathy, they just get sharper, and they come so much more easier. Like people just are saying, wow, I am making decisions like I've never done before, or I've just rekindled with an old person who I never thought I would ever see. And I thought about them, and boom, there I see them at the supermarket. Or what, like there's this really interesting intuition that builds from this solid regulated nervous system state.
It puts you back in the flow of life, properly,
And one thing I will add, that's because it's important, is when we have this regulation on board, it also keeps us out of danger.
Okay.
And that comes back to that polyvagal world, and what Stephen Porges coined as neuroception. I'm actually thinking of a student's story that I have to share. She lived, or used to live, in like somewhere in the Alps, somewhere in Europe. And she was driving one day, and for whatever reason, she had an impulse to stop her car. And I don't know if you've driven through the mountain Alps of like Switzerland and Austria, but there's like, they're little roads, and there's lots of grass, and it's not like Canada in any way, shape, or form. But she had this desire to stop her car. She went with what her gut said, even though there was no reason to. Her car was fine. And all of a sudden, Niall, a house that was being lifted with the crane dropped right in front of her on the road. Like they lost it.
Oh my God.
And I'm getting tingles in my head just thinking about it, because in that moment when that happened, she was regulating and learning to follow the impulse of her body. And we were teaching her that. And it made zero sense. Why am I stopping my car? I do this drive every single day. So those are the kinds of things that we start to experience where we are where we're not put into danger. We're actually into better safety because of this, whatever you want to call it, intuition, gut sense, interoception, neuroception. It's pretty cool.
That reminds me of something I've heard elsewhere, and this might be complete nonsense. So please feel free to fact check me on this.
I can't wait to hear.
But I think during the tsunami in 2003, the really bad one in Southeast Asia, apparently barely any animals were killed, because for some reason they just got out of the area a lot quicker than humans did, because they sensed something was coming or whatever,
100. Oh no, I don't have to fact check that. Like I am sure that they could feel the pressure change in the water, the vibration. Yeah, they're like, something's not right. We need to get out of here. 100%.
I'm gonna look it up after myself just to
yeah.
That. It's something, you've mentioned there a few things. It's not just about being able to be regulated in one context. It's being able to bring this to almost every aspect of your life as a practice, and from my interactions with you, Irene, you seem that you carry this regulated state with you through most of the things you do. Even the way somebody writes an email is a very good indicator of how regulated they are. And your emails are very calm, focused, centered. It's like, oh, that's easy. That's easy to read. You know what I mean?
No one's ever given me that feedback. Thank you.
But you get emails, and it's just like someone just went, and it's like there's no thought into it. But anyway, I want to make that comment.
Well, to give my team credit, we do have someone who proofreads them. Okay. And I don't write an email in 10 minutes. Like I'm a writer at heart. And then of course I still get test emails and I edit them. So, but I try to write them as a conversation with that engagement. And sometimes humor is important as well, right? Or else it's just blah and dry.
I'd like to ask now, Irene, to what extent do you think that our behaviors our behaviors are hardwired? You know, what to what extent are they locked in?
That's a great question. I did a video on this earlier this year. I'm going to see if I can quote myself. I might not be able to, but I had done the video in almost a reaction to something I had heard on an interview with someone else, where they were saying that we're hardwired. And the example they gave was he had heard of this story of a woman who had ridden horses when she was a teenager. And whenever she rode the horses, it was her way of having a cigarette, having a smoke. And so she would get away and smoke because the smell of the horse would kind of mask the cigarette smoke. That was kind of the story. Fast forward to when she was an adult and had her own daughter, and she thought it'd be great to take her daughter out on horses because it was part of her life growing up. And apparently, as soon as she got on this horse and smelled the horse, you know, there's a very specific smell, she had an instant craving for a cigarette. And so the person's assumption is we're just hardwired. That is never going to go away. And I would say, well, it depends on the tools you have to shift the wiring. If you're only working with the cognitive brain, which is, I don't want to smoke, I don't want to smoke, or something more hypnotherapy, you know, hypnotizing, where you're just working with the higher brain and maybe the subconscious, then yeah, maybe you won't get rid of that craving. But I would be like, what was going on in that household that made you have to hide? Because of course, most teenagers don't want to know. They don't want their parents to know they're smoking. I get that. But you know, what was going on? What was the quality that was happening in your life? Like, what was causing you to need to have that nicotine hit that is kind of soothing or can be stimulating for a person? Like, what was going on somatically in the body? And how can we dissect the sensation and the visceral reaction and the neurochemistry that's occurring when that nicotine hits the blood-brain barrier and all those sorts of things? So it's like, are we hardwired, or is the behavior? It's like, well, it depends on how you help shift it. So I think it really depends on what you're working with. Now, because I like to kind of put another piece to certain things. If someone had the kind of neglect that Bruce Perry talks about in some of his books, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Bruce Perry's work.
I've heard of him, but I've never actually read any of his stuff.
So he wrote the book, The Boy Who Was Raised, I think, as a Dog. Born for Love is another book. He just co-wrote a book with Oprah on trauma, which apparently is really good. But he is a psychiatrist that was brought in when, like, and I'm again making a generalization, when like they would find a kid that has been in a kennel, like severe neglect, or orphanages that they have studied in. I think Romania is kind of the classic, but I'm sure they're all over, where babies are literally not touched, not played with, not talked to. From what I've learned, that is not recoverable, because we need to myelinate and have connection, and we have to see faces, and we have to talk and see all the expressions. We have to be held. And even if we're being held and talked to and it's abusive, we still come out fairly civilized. But when we aren't learning those base level skills at the beginning, then yes, I always wanted to talk to him about this. I don't think that behavior can be changed because it was born out of true neglect and not teaching that human the intense, really, apprenticeship that a human needs to have full function, not just in their brain, but in their movements and their empathy. But yeah, Born for Love is like probably in my opinion, the one book that puts all the pieces together, with all sorts of different stories that are quite shocking to say the least, right? It's incredible that this man is still doing his work, because he was like the doctor that I think was brought in after the Waco crisis in Texas, you know, with the Davidian cults and these kids that were just completely brainwashed and neglected. And he's like, these kids will never totally be normal functioning members of society. I might be paraphrasing that, but essentially, so yeah, to go back, behavior is I don't think hardwired for most of us, but it depends on the level of neglect. And if someone's listening to this right now and has access to a computer and can nod when I nod and can smile if I make funny faces, like, then you're fine. Like, you have the capacity to engage and see that. So even the fact of wanting to learn this material and listen is pretty much yeah, you're not hardwired, you can change. Does that make sense, that distinction?
Yeah, totally. That's an important thing.
Yeah.
To make. So I'm conscious of time, Irene. I'm going to just ask a couple more questions.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So one of the things in researching this interview I find most interesting was your theory on self-sabotage and why we self-sabotage. You know, could you maybe tell us about that there, and your thoughts on why we do that?
It kind of funnels into a little bit of what we've been talking about already. So again, if you were brought up with a lot of fear, a lot of being on edge, you know, having to expect that the humans around you are going to treat you badly and that nothing good is ever going to happen. You might see where I'm going here. When someone starts to improve their lives, maybe it's through listening to this conversation or seeing a therapist or starting to eat better. The moment they start to feel a rewiring, a change in that behavior, if you will, there's a part of them, again, if they don't understand how our system works, that will kick them back to the old pattern because it's more familiar. And so when we start to pave a new way, like literally through the forest, if you think about that, it's like really gnarly, you know, like there's no path. It's much easier to go back to the path that is like fully graveled, paved, stop signs, stoplights. We know where everything is. It's easy. You can do that with your eyes closed. But you're going down this new path that's so foreign, like it actually might feel weird and scary when you're being better to yourself because it's so unknown. And so what often people will do, I think there's even a term, it's called health anxiety. Okay. Don't quote me on that, but I've heard it. And it's a person will get anxious because they're getting better.
Wow.
And this comes back to that thing that I mentioned about kids who have to fawn and change to be part of a really sick, dysfunctional family. Think about that. If you were raised for 18 years of your life in that kind of soup, and now you're in this great relationship and you've got money and you like what you do, like that's like 180 degrees. It's like you're in the upside down, right? And so it's like, okay, this is actually good, but everything in my cellular physiology is saying this is bad, but it's good. Yeah. And so then the person will, you know, pick a fight with the partner that they know totally loves them and doesn't mind them freaking out over the glass breaking on the floor, you know, or a person will be doing really well in their career and then they do something to not finish the project because I don't deserve goodness because I always failed my math tests, to go back to me as a kid, right? Think how many kiddos were reprimanded and punished when they didn't do well. You know, so it's like you don't do well with something. If you were in that boat of having that exposure to that toxic shame, you will throw yourself back into that and not even know why. And so that's a little blip. I did a whole lecture on the sabotage thing, but yeah, it all comes back to our early years and what we were told we were able to have and deserve. It's really interesting. And to see people break out of that is super cool. because, you'll have someone who's literally 70 years old, because we have, elderly, I don't like to use that word, but the older generations are in our programs, and they'll have this small win that is just so small, but it's so big. And it's so big because they've never acknowledged something good, because nothing good ever happened. So that's like a little peek into the whole sabotage realm. I mean, it happens so much.
We're with you on the way, so thanks so much for what you're doing, and wish you all the best going forward.
Thanks so much, Niall, for having me. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to hear the full version, you can do so with the Weekend University Premium membership. This gets you access to our master library of over 230 talks and interviews with the world's leading psychologists, professors, and authors, as well as transcripts, CPD certification, quizzes, and unlimited access to the recordings from our annual conferences. For more information, please go to theweekenduniversity.com/membership.